Heavenly Father, we come before you today as always and recognizing that we are here to just open up and understand and learn from you what it is you would have us to know. We have looked at this book this week. We have done our homework. We have some ideas, but we want to come together and bring together those ideas and have a clearer picture of the overview of this book so that when we go into chapter studies and go deeper, we can keep it in the context of the whole. There's a lot that we've learned already about this book, Father, but we have so much more. So we ask that you guide our discussion today, cause us to focus on the things that we should, and to stay on track. We thank you for it all and ask for it all in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so this week we started our study of the book of First Thessalonians. We will go into Second Thessalonians when we're done. And we did our overview week. And sometimes the overview week for me tends to be the harder, I guess because I want all the answers and you don't get all the answers right away. But I also find that I love the inductive Bible study method, and it seems to me to work best when you're studying a book like First Thessalonians, an epistle. And so, in the method of the inductive Bible study, which you were taking through this week, hang on, somebody wants in. You were taking through it in your lessons. I hope you recognized it. But some of the things that we know are that we look first for those very normal, very obvious things. So that's the puzzle pieces that are the, flat-sided corners or edges of your puzzle. Because some obscure one piece can't be placed on the puzzle board because you can't put it in context with anything else. So we start with the obvious. So the most obvious thing about a letter, well, number one, I should ask you what type of literature is this, but I've already told you it is a letter. And what is the most obvious thing about any letter that we know?
The author and the recipient.
Yes. And that's it. Very obvious. And so the first step would be you take what is obvious and you look at it. So we examined it this week by making lists of all the things like marking who the author is, marking the recipients, and making lists of what we learn about those. And we were told not to make a list of the instructions given because that doesn't tell us as much. That's not really about the people. It's just telling them what to do and how to live, things that we can learn from. But that's not part of that. If you wrote them, that's fine too. But as you go through that process, this isn't just a task. This is not just homework. Just do this because it's obvious. From that, what we began to see is less obvious things. Like before you ever read the book of First Thessalonians, and then you start marking down those facts about the author and facts about the recipient, you begin to see some things throughout. And then you can start exploring those. So it's basically that solving a mystery. You take one thing and you pull that thread and see where it takes you. So as you did that particular exercise this week and went through the book, the other value in doing it that way is if you go through and mark a word, phrase, or in this case, an author or a recipient, if you mark one time through, you've read it one time through. And hopefully you read it and then you did that. So that would be 2 times through. Then if you did the recipient, you did it 3 times through. And then later when we do some of the other things that become more obvious and we start marking those, that's another time through. So the more you read the text, the more familiar you become with it, the more those obscure things start coming to the surface to be examined. So number one, answer the question, who is the author?
Well,
Paul specifically, Paul primarily, he named Silvanus, which is also Silas. He's called both, and Timothy. This is typical of Paul in most of his letters. He will name who is with him. Also, we found in our study this week that Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy had a relationship with the recipients. So he names them, and so we're going to focus on Paul primarily. But if you look through many times, Paul refers to the authors in plural. So, he uses like we instead of I most of the time throughout the letter. So, but most of the time we're just going to say Paul as the author. Who are the recipients?
The Church of Thessalonians?
Yes. Yes, at the Church of Thessalonians, that's the name of the book.
Yeah.
Paul's epistles tend to be named by the person he wrote them to, whereas Peter wrote and we name his epistles after him. And Jude is another that is named after the person who wrote it. So just typical. Paul did not title this letter First Thessalonians. Paul didn't do that. We do that. Somebody in some point, one of those councils that put together things decided that. All right. Now, as we look at Paul as the author, at Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy, but Paul as the author and the Thessalonians as the recipients, what were some of the themes? What were some of the, well, actually, you can answer different type because you answered different questions this week. What were some of the things that you wanted to emulate or you admired about the authors in this book? What are some of the things you learned about them and you said, that's a good quality?
Persistence.
Okay.
The logic
Specifically
they
towards
had.
what? Persistence in what?
Mhm. Prayer?
Definitely. Yeah.
Praying. Yeah, I would say praying. Habit of giving thanks. Constantly mentioning the recipients in prayers.
Yes. And Janice, were you about to say something?
The love that they had towards the church.
Yeah, that came through really strongly and clearly. And it's not just love Paul. Like, it's not just an ending statement. It was clearly spelled out. Their love for each other, the author and the recipients, but also he pointed out the recipients' love for one another, the brethren, the believers, and even people that weren't like other people. They were encouraged to extend that. So yes, love, consistency, as Sandy said, and we were saying consistency in prayer. What else? Like, just name some of the other characteristics that are great qualities that are proven out through this, what Paul has said for the people who wrote this.
They were upright and blameless towards the believers.
Yeah, and that's huge. I remember one of the first times as a young Christian hearing or thinking like it's probably through Paul saying something about being blameless. And I remember just the weight that fell off. I mean, you may have felt at your salvation. Like I think it was Paul Bunyan in the Pilgrim's Progress, equated it to like this backpack being taken off. And you think about a purse or a backpack or a piece of luggage or something like that. It's usually not that big a deal until you carry it for a long time. And like if you've ever been backpacking, if you've ever been hiking, that whole pack that you put on that hopefully has got a frame and supported and belted on right and everything else, when you first take off, it's no big deal. But after a while, it just gets heavier and nothing changes about it, but it feels heavier and heavier. So when you think about the weight of your sin, the weight of your guilt, and when you hear Paul say blameless, I'm just telling you, it just makes me feel so, it's comforting, but it's like it just a weight falls off. And like I said, Paul Bunyan kind of pictured it as that weight falling off at the foot of the cross. And that is a great word picture as well. But okay, so blameless. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, these are new believers, right? That these, right? Are these, they're mainly Greek and, what are they, Greek and Roman and Jewish communities?
Well, Yes, because Rome is the ruling power of the day. So
Yeah,
they were part of the Roman Empire, and
uh-huh.
their heritage is Greek because of, as a matter of fact, I did a little bit of history study this week. I don't know if you looked up anything about Macedonia this week. And I was like the whole time going, oh, 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 because I'm going to name Philip of Macedonia. Philip of Macedonia, who was the king of Macedonia, was the father of Alexander, who became Alexander the Great. So this is the Macedonia. Philip had conquered many of the Greek city-states, and when his father died and Alexander became king, he's the one that tore across all of the known world and conquered and built the boundaries of the Greek Empire and extended it way farther than this area of Macedonia that he started with. And so that's interesting. And then later, that because they had a particular fighting style that was called a phalanx, and later the Romans were able to overcome that. Nobody else had seemed to. So when you think about Alexander, when I think about Alexander, I think about in the book of Daniel, the Greek Empire that is later before that was Daniel didn't knew about it through prophecy, but the Alexander is portrayed basically as a is it a leopard? Yeah, it's a leopard, which is the fastest cat, right? And so he just tore across. That's the Macedonia we're talking about. And that that's the country, I guess. And then Thessaloniki was the one of the most prominent cities, and it grew and grew and grew, but it was a coastal town, and whereas the land around it was very fertile, the it was a coastal town that gave them a port where back in, I think it was in Philip's day, he used a river to get from place to place, but it became silted up. You know how like the Mississippi dumps
Mhm.
into the Gulf, all that silt. Well, it got so silted up, it was not they weren't able to traverse it very well. And so he needed a port, and he chose Thessalonica. So it became a very, very prominent place, a very important place. Therefore, with ships coming and going, it had deep harbor, it had access, it was because of where it was basically protected from the harsh wind, most of the harsh winds that would come. So it was perfectly set. So this is that we might look at Thessalonians and or Thessaloniki and look at our map because we have to
Mhm.
have a map to tell us where it is. And we may look at it and think, well, it's just a small little place, big deal. It doesn't mean that much to us, except for that there are two books written to it. And we're studying them. So that's a little bit of the background. Later, Rome conquered Greece, and they conquered specifically Thessaloniki. And according to what I read, they were given basically freedom. They really weren't free because nobody under the Roman Empire was free, but they were given some freedoms and they had to pay tribute to Rome. But it turns out that the tribute they paid to Rome was actually less than what they had been paying to the king. So they kind of liked the Roman rule. It's over time. They kind of were rebellious for a while, but over time they became very Roman. So at this point, when Paul is visiting and then writing to them, they're very Roman. It's under the Roman Empire, and they have absorbed he talks about they turned from idols. They had absorbed Egyptian idols, Greek idols, um, Roman gods, all of it. And remember, when we think about, and I'm switching from the author to the recipients, but when you're thinking about the Roman Empire, the people of the Roman Empire looked to the Caesar as a god. So they were used to worshiping humans as well. Now, they might um, give them a different status than the average person. Like I said, they might be what they would call demigods or gods. Um, It's just it's a foreign concept to us. It, at least to me, to think in these terms. But that's some of what Paul walked into. All right. So when we learn about the people of Macedonia, Thessalonica, what do we learn about them that at this point that we would also see as a positive character trait, something that we would want to emulate?
I think under persecution, they were, they were, uh, uh, their faith and labor and love for one another. I don't know. It could
Well,
be,
for one thing, you brought up the fact that they were persecuted. Like
yeah.
they, okay, so there's that. So when, as part of the process of looking at the author and recipient and themes start coming to the surface, one of them is suffering or affliction or persecution or tribulation. There's all kinds of words, but all of it, opposition was even another word that was used. So we start beginning to see circumstances that they're living under. And from that, like you're saying, they persevered. They had faith, hope, and love. I'm sorry, taken from our First Corinthians look, but they had those qualities. Anything else that you looked at and said, this is a good quality, something that we should also be doing or admire?
I think they lived their lives openly among the people to serve as a model for their faith and the social, because I think they were being afflicted social, not only physically, but
Yeah.
socially as well. So, yeah.
Okay. So you
Yeah.
said that it says you became an example to all believers. So we
Yeah.
see also they were imitators of both Paul, Sylvia, of the author, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. They were imitators of them, but we also saw that they were imitators of the churches of God. Um,
Mhm.
and so uh, sometimes in our American ways, we want to be so independent and self-actualized and doing things our way that we don't want to be looked on as imitators. But there is a reason and a positive way that we can be imitating, especially if it's somebody like Paul. We look to scripture to find who we need to be following in the footsteps of, and that's what they were doing. Um, when you looked this week at the chronology of Paul's life, where did you find his visit to the Thessalonians the first time? Well, number one, I just told you he did visit the Thessalonians as he was writing them. That comes out. But when did he visit, and when did he write these books?
I know he visited in the book of Acts. I know he's in like three synagogues.
Yeah.
Um, I know that was and I know that's why what did they do? They got him out of there because they snuck him out, I don't know, in a basket or something, and he left them. And
That one wasn't the basket one, but yes, he was
yeah,
in trouble. He got in trouble
right.
there, and
And he had to get out of there. Yeah,
he had to get out of there. And so they
yeah.
sent him away.
And that,
The context that you saw in Acts, which is always good when it's amazing to me that within just the book of Thessalonians, we could pick up on the affliction. We could pick up on the suffering of not just the people in Thessaloniki, but Paul and his cohort. They had faced it because it says it in chapter 2 that they knew of what Paul had endured, or the authors had endured in Philippi. And if you look on your map, Philippi is not that far away. But Paul had been in Philippi prior to being in Thessaloniki. And there, when you go back to Acts and look at it, they had a mob had formed, and they were being threatened because they had disrupted life in Philippi, and disrupted one man's commerce. Like he had this girl who had the spirit of divination, and Paul got ticked off with her, and he cast out that spirit. She no longer could make that man money, and he got mad. So he took them to the council, the city leaders. So so they had been treated really badly in Philippi at the end. Now they also established a church there, and they had believers that came to people that came into belief. But so in the context of this time that Paul is dealing with, Paul has given them an example to the people in Thessalonians, the Thessalonians in Thessaloniki, Thessaloniki, sorry, he had given them an example of how you endure through suffering. Now, he was telling them about it. They may have heard about it. Like the news might have come through somebody visiting the city, who knows? But he also gave them an example of how to be bold during suffering, during that persecution. And he says of them, when he spoke to them the gospel of God, he did it amid opposition. So Paul is an example of how to deal with suffering. And when he came to the Thessalonians, they heard the word, received the word in tribulation. Paul gave the gospel against much opposition. Okay, we don't know exactly what that opposition might look like unless we go to something like Acts. If it tells us the details, like we know about what happened in Philippi, but we can get some ideas. I mentioned before in the history that I looked up of the Thessalonians, they had it reminded me of what you hear about Athens, how many gods they had, how many cults or religious practices they had. It was just an abundance. Basically, they could have, a god for everything. And I don't know if you've ever encountered anybody that like prayed to somebody other than the one true God, thinking that dead person, was going to do something for them. That's idol worship. Same with what they were dealing with, but they would have either stories of real people that they turned into gods and worshiped them, and always little g God. But you can imagine when Paul comes in and his gospel, now when Paul comes in, his gospel presents one God, one true God, and you have to walk away from all of that idol worship in order to truly worship the one true God. That's radical. It's really radical. And you were saying that maybe Jim was saying that maybe they weren't just facing physical suffering, which would result, but they would have faced social suffering. They would be ostracized from families. They would maybe lose their businesses. The implications are huge here. But when I was looking up some background for Macedonia, there was also, I remember there was somebody wrote about this person who she called her one sheep her flock. She called her one cow her herd. And when when predators came along and killed off her animals, she had nothing. And then it went on to say she committed suicide because she had no ability to eat and feed. So this was true of a lot of people in Thessalonians, a lot of the Thessalonians in their world and in their life. It was poverty. The Romans kept them poor. The Romans had divided up a strong country so that they're into different provinces or different regions, and they were struggling. Many, many times they were struggling. It was a big city, and just like our cities, you can go into our cities, you could look and go, like you could go to New York and you could look around and think, wow, look at these huge buildings. Look at all this hustle and bustle. It's a thriving and strong and powerful city. But it doesn't take much to look down at the individual people and realize they're suffering and they're struggling. Some, not all, but they're struggling. And you've got homeless there all over, but you got a lot of homeless there. So it's not everybody is prospering. There's a few that are, and it's going really well for them, but the average person is struggling. So when you take that and you add in, some of them have made a radical decision to leave their lifestyle behind, to walk away from idolatry, which was consuming every aspect of their lives. And they leave that, they probably lose their ability to eat basic stuff, their ability to make money, their ability to make money so that they can eat and provide for their families. So their suffering and their opposition would impact them severely. Okay, so we see this theme coming up of suffering and affliction, tribulation, opposition. There's a lot of words for it. It's the same, all same idea. Not just that Paul has suffered it, but that these people in Thessaloniki are suffering as well, and had suffered when Paul came with the gospel. And so as this is the process, so as you've written your list of the author and the recipients, you started finding these themes of things that we can be glad about. Like Paul's not coming at them as he does in some of his letters, fussing at them. Like you don't see him. It's mostly all commendation. He says good things about him, and he does give them instructions because we could all improve, right? But there's not condemnation. You don't see that. At least I didn't. If you see something and remind me. Sometimes in some of his letters, he has to go really drill down to even a specific person and what's going on with that person. I think of 1 Corinthians 5. And he has to point that out and call them sometimes on the carpet for not dealing with it, or how they dealt with it, or just to give them instruction. Like, you haven't been dealing with this, but now you are going to.
But Peggy, were
Yeah.
these mainly Gentiles that he was addressing?
Well, when
Or was
Paul's normal is to go into any place, and he goes where?
it was a Jew? Yeah, because I know there was a Jewish community, and I think the Gentiles, and I think was it the Greek, also the
Well,
Greek,
Greeks
Greece?
are Gentiles, but yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, whenever he would go into a city, if there was a synagogue, and that there were rules for how many Jewish men had to be there to form a synagogue, and that would just mean that there was a larger Jewish community. So this group in Thessaloniki would have at least known about Judaism, because there were some Jews there. They may have looked at the people that were Jewish and just said, okay, that's just one more God. Or they might have had, the Jews would have been, if they were practicing Jews, would have been set apart because they would have been very different with their one God. That's the one thing when you look at Israel, that little bitty country, and you look at what surrounds it and always has surrounded it once they went into the promised land, it was always monotheism versus polytheism. And then you have Islam that comes along later, and they also have one God, Allah. They're not right, but just saying they're monotheistic also. And yet they fight very much against, because some people want to claim it's the same God. It's not, because they want to kill off all the Jews. But anyway, so yeah, there would have been a Jewish presence. That's where Paul would have started. He always did, in every city. If there were, as we saw in our study in Acts this week, when he went into Philippi, he had to go to the shore, or go to the riverbank, and he found Lydia and other women because that was the practice of the Jews. If they didn't have a synagogue, they would usually go by a body of water and have a prayer time. So that's where Paul found Lydia, and she listened to the gospel. she took it to her household. She and all of them got baptized, and became believers. And she was from Thyatira, so she would have taken the word back to Thyatira. She was also a merchant trader, and so she would have traveled and taken the word with her. So it's a great story, but it also just shows you Paul's practices. Whenever he went to the city, the first group he tried to find were Jews. And not just try to find, he always found the Jews. And he presented to the Jews first. Now, in any synagogue, you can have Gentiles that are associated with Jews. So there could have been and should have been that influence, right? There might have been some people in Thessalonica that would have maybe embraced Judaism to some extent, at least. Maybe they weren't, they might have straddled that fence and looked at Judaism as acceptable, but they kept their multi-god worship going on, polytheism. But anyway, they do there. So there were some Jews, but we know, Paul would have told you that Christianity is a completion of true Judaism. And so it is Jesus fulfilling everything, right? But you don't, I hate to say you don't stay Jewish. You do. You never leave your roots of Judaism, but you come to a better understanding. So some people call it completed Jews, Messianic Jews. There's different terms for it. And a fullness that in some ways we lack because we don't have that background. And so in some ways I can be kind of envious of them. But Paul would have been presenting to the Jews, and he also would have presented to Gentiles. But when I was asking, if you look at your sequence of events in Paul's life, you find, because we were looking even over on the side at Acts, you would have found that Paul would have, it says the first and second Thessalonians were written during his second missionary journey. And his second missionary journey spans the years of 49 to 52 AD. So that's only 3 to 4 years if you encompass both 49 and 52. But so in a period of about 4 years, 3-something years, Paul not only went to Thessaloniki, but he also wrote to them. So the time frame between when he went and when he wrote is short. It's a short time frame. And it's almost as if he left and immediately wanted to go back. You sense that without looking at that chart, staying in First Thessalonians, you sense that in what he writes about and how he writes. In chapter 3, he says, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind in Athens alone. And then they sent Timothy, who was with them, when he wrote. And so they had sent Timothy, and he'd come back. So there's been a period of time that they went, they left, they sent Timothy back, and Timothy had come back to them and had been able to give them a report. And they were very, very good. Think about what Paul is conveying by saying how he was very concerned for them, that they would have, let's see, where is okay, in verse 5 of 3, he says, when I could endure it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you and our labor should be in vain. So Paul is telling you right there what he perceived could have been going on, right? He knew they had received the gospel in tribulation, in opposition. And as you see in chapter 2, it says that You endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews. He's likening it to the Jews that would come in like they did in Philippi. Remember, they came in, made accusations against Paul. A lot of places he went, if not everywhere, they would come in, and sometimes they came in behind Paul, like he'd be gone, and they would come in and cause confusion, by saying you got to be circumcised or whatever. But he's not saying necessarily that it's the Jews that are causing them problems. He's saying, like how that his own countrymen are coming against him, their own countrymen are coming against them and have been from the beginning of Paul being there. And his concern was that they would have been tempted to they might have been tempted, and that their labor should be in vain, that they would have lost, and left and not been able to stay true to the faith. But Paul gave a different report. I mean, Timothy came back with a different report of their faith and their love, how they think kindly of Paul and his crew, and how they also long to see Paul and Timothy and Silvanus again. So that it's mutual. Paul longs to see them, they long to see him. But again, in some of these statements, you can find the circumstances that Paul is talking about that the Thessalonians are in. And we can get an understanding of what they went through. We can take this however, but one is I'm very grateful that we don't have this level of persecution in our country. Now it's coming, it's increasing, and there are some families, like, you do lose people sometimes when you become a Christian. Maybe not as harshly as we're hearing described here, but you can probably sit there and think about the effect that your salvation had. Some it draws, and others it pushes away. And we got to be careful that we don't run after those relationships. You want to try to reconcile, don't get me wrong, but you don't run after those relationships and give up the truth in the process. Don't be tempted by that. So we have some context here. We have some idea just by looking at the text itself. Yes, we did go outside to Acts to get some context of what Paul was talking about happened to him in Philippi, but just in the book of Thessalonians, we can learn about these afflictions, and we can learn about the tribulation, and we can learn about what they're facing. So that is a main theme that came out, a main idea that came to the surface by looking at those obvious things, which are the author and the recipients. Another theme, what was another theme that came out throughout this book?
The coming of Christ.
Yes, very much so, strongly. And in every chapter, there was some reference to and some mention of the coming of Christ, which tells you something. It tells you that this is something that they were concerned about. Obviously, Paul would have taught that pretty much everywhere he went. He would have taught this, but not every book focuses on that. Not every book that we study of Paul's writings focuses on as much as First Thessalonians has. So we have these kind of dual themes. We've got the afflictions and sufferings, and we also have the coming of Christ. And it results in there's a statement in every chapter. So when you did your observation worksheet this week, we're not going to recreate the whole thing, but we can hopefully fill in some of it. So in chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we know who the author is. You can say just Paul, or you can say Paul and crew, Paul et al. That's what I started doing in my notes, just put et al. It's kind of a legal term. And then we're looking at the purpose. You can write down the key words. They gave you some. You'll probably add to that list. Right now, we can at least add, afflictions, sufferings, tribulations, any of those synonyms. And then also the day of the Lord or the coming of the Lord, any of that. Which, by the way, the day of the Lord and the coming of the Lord may not be the same thing, but it's still referring to Jesus's return. So we looked at our chart, and so we can guess that this was towards maybe the end of his second missionary journey, because he would have had to have visited them, left, and written. So we're thinking it was around 51 AD, somewhere in the range of 49 to 52, but probably around 51 AD that it was written. If you want to put a date on it, we don't always get that, and you didn't get that from the text. You got that from a different chart. But
Would this be the first letter that you think that he was written?
to the Thessalonians,
Yeah.
I have no idea. But it
Okay.
kind of sounds like it is,
Yeah.
because of his concern and the fact that he sent Timothy and Timothy came back. It could be the first. It's the first one. It's our first
Mhm.
book, our Bible. When we study Second Thessalonians, we might be able to look at that even more clearly to see did that letter come first. And as you study other, I think it's Corinthians. We have First and Second Corinthians. There is a reference to another letter, so that is not in the canon. And I didn't make the decision of why not, and why it wasn't preserved, but we don't have it to look at. But Paul references it. So there might have been, over time, multiple letters that went back and forth. Most of these letters, and in some other places, he tells them very clearly to have these letters read in other churches. Basically, like us, other believers need to hear this, and we get it later. But and then he might even say, read the letter I sent to them yourself. So um, it's it's in that period of time when the church is being established and these books were preserved, these letters were preserved for us to be able to look at and to study and to learn from. And while we've done a lot of focus on them, the author and the recipients, we also at some point have got to get to us. Like, what does this mean to us, and what can we take from this? We have talked about that a little bit. Like, what would we like to be like them? In what ways would we like to be like them? But we will establish a theme, but let's look at our chapter themes. As you look at each chapter, we're not going into great detail. We're surface level at this point, but thinking about those two themes, that's kind of what came to the surface, what came to the most awareness, is those two main themes of affliction and the coming of Christ. What would you say a good title or chapter theme for chapter 1 is?
I took it from verse 7 and I said, be an example as you wait for the Lord.
Okay, that's a good one. All right. Anybody else? Remember, these are not hard and fast. Like, there's not one right answer, unless you write something that has nothing to do with that chapter. But it's always good, like she did, she was saying, is to take the words. You took the words right from the verses. That's very helpful as well. Anybody else? Okay, I wrote, they received God's word in tribulation and sounded forth. I think you could easily I put sounded forth, but you could easily put that example. They were example to other believers, and they sounded forth the word of the Lord sounded forth. But then I just put a slash because I'm kind of doing a dual theme. And the second part is they're waiting on Jesus's return. But again, you put what you may have different words, you may have written it a little bit differently. But I just am I'm focusing on those two themes, and trying to summarize each chapter. So in the second chapter, thinking about affliction, thinking about Jesus' return, what would you say the second chapter is about? Okay, there was opposition to the gospel, but it does its work. The gospel does its work. And then the theme about Jesus's return has to do with they are Paul's joy and crown of exaltation at his coming. So what about chapter 3?
Yeah.
Paul says they were strengthened and encouraged in their afflictions.
Oh, okay.
Or because of their afflictions. And he says, he prays the Lord would establish their hearts blameless at his coming. And you can add to that, you can say,
I know it talks about faith and love too, and that's sort of stood out to me. It's a good news about your faith and love, and
yep,
that would
that's and that can be part of your theme, or your chapter theme, and that's because that is the faith and love that they show, and is part of what's maintaining them.
another thing that stood out to me. Sometimes we don't really think about this. I never seen this myself. For indeed, we were with you, and we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction, as it's so it may come to pass, as you know. But says, don't. What he writes before that, so that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we have been destined for this.
Yes.
And maybe they didn't know that that all these afflictions are, because they probably think, what's God doing? Did he abandon me or?
Well,
And
definitely that's a question that comes up for all of us. And we
yeah,
put this
and that's
back into,
yeah. Okay, go
well,
ahead. I'm
Paul
sorry.
had left Philippi because of what had happened there. He comes to them and he tells
Mhm.
them that story. And in telling them that, he's not just saying, those horrible people in Philippi and look how they treated me. It's awful. That's not how he would present it. He was saying, this is what happens. So, when Jesus says, count the cost, and he says, if you're a builder and you're about to build a building, you have plans, you go and buy, you need to have a list of materials. And at the bottom line, you need to count the cost. This is the picture Jesus is giving. And he's
Mhm.
saying it about us in salvation. Count the
Mhm.
cost. If a person does not count the cost when they go into salvation, what's the tendency? They
You're
fall
gonna
away.
fall away. Yeah.
They fall away. because, but sometimes we get complacent, things go pretty well in life, and we're hit by some life circumstance, and we do like what you were saying. It's like, where's God? Did he abandon me? What, or why God? Why me? And we need to come back to something like this and remember that Jesus promised us afflictions. Paul is saying, I told you about my afflictions and that I'm destined for this. Remember Paul's call. Paul's call was from the beginning, when he was still blinded, was you're going to go before Gentiles, you're going to go before Jews, you're going to go before kings, and you're going to suffer for my sake. Paul, from the beginning, before the scales fell off his eyes, was told that. Okay. If we present the gospel as this is going to solve all your problems, every issue is going to go away, the road's going to be smooth from now on. And there's a lot of prosperity gospel teachers out there that are like that. Believing in Jesus is going to make you rich. That's a really crass way of putting it, but basically that's their message. And if that's our message, if we aren't watching how we present the gospel and not, we're going to set people up for failure. We're going to set them up for them to come back to us and say, what in the world did you talk me into? What in the world? And is it truly salvation anyway? But you still have to understand. And so Paul warned them in advance, and he says, why? So that you would not be disturbed when you hear about, because Paul's not done with affliction.
No, and then
More coming.
I know it's later what he mentions of the tempter comes along, and that's
Yes.
what he mentioned in verse 5.
Yes. And then when you think about this group of people, young Christians without the full canon of scripture, but they saw Paul, himself, and he visited them, probably went back through as well. You've got this group, but later and down the line, when they hear about Paul's arrest, when they hear about Paul being taken to Rome in chains, when they hear about any of the other things that happened between this time and the end of Paul's life, it could really shake them up. They could doubt. Like if you think about your pastor being drug out of the court, drug out of your church one Sunday and put in jail and all this stuff, until you start hearing the details, you're going to wonder, like, what in the world? What, have I been listening to somebody that's a criminal? Like, what in the world's going on? And but when you understand who Paul is, and you understand that he was being arrested for the gospel, not for some crime he committed. Now, the Romans might have considered it a crime. Why would the Romans consider Paul's message a crime?
I think he was putting Jesus above Caesar. Was that some of it?
That was the main part.
I mean, right now, and that's happening today. So it's like nothing's new under the sun. I mean,
absolutely. But very much so, when you put it back into the culture of the day, the Romans didn't just look at Caesar as a god, which they did, but Paul comes along and says, no, not just Caesar's not a god, there's only one true God. And he tells the gospel clearly and truly, and they're believing in it. Well, then they have just gone against Rome. Paul is going against Rome because it was illegal to not see Caesar, to not worship Caesar. So this is very countercultural. And we don't have that type of situation in our country. Ever do any of us hopefully, ever look at the president of the United States as a god? I mean, none of it. It's just not part of our way of thinking. Whoever is in office, it doesn't matter. We don't, but do we not sometimes in our talk about elections think this person is going to save us, save our country, whatever? He should do his job. He should fulfill the role. He should keep his promises, but he's not God. And he's not going to solve politics in general is not going to solve all our problems. And yet we have governments, we have a system. We want to believe that it's going to work. So that's chapter 3 is he wants them to be strengthened and encouraged in their afflictions, and he prays that the Lord will establish their hearts blameless at before the Father at his coming with all the saints. You could have added all that, but I just simplified it a little bit. Even just stating at his coming with all the saints is kind of cool. And we'll look into that, I know, when we get into chapter 3 further. In chapter 4, what would you summarize this one? What's going on in chapter 4? Actually, this is a good place to show that there is a shift. That the first 3 chapters deal with something, and then the last 2 chapters deal with something else. They're called segment divisions. So this is a history of both the author and the recipients. Now you could put Paul and Thessalonians. You could write that however you want. But as you see in chapters 1 through 3, he talks about their history, who they are, who he is, what their relationship was like, the fact that he came, the fact that he wants to go back. That's what's covered in the first 3 chapters. In chapters 4 and 5, what do you see as a shift? What is going on there?
He wants them to excel in sanctification.
Yes, he wants to, that's a very specific, yes. He wants them to excel in their sanctification. He wants them to excel in their love for one another. By the way, if you didn't notice, excel still more is a key repeated phrase. So I'm glad you picked up on it. And so you can mark it so that you can see it in the places. But those are things, but that's very specific, and it's a good one that we definitely will look further into when we get to chapter 4 and study it. But in a more general sense, you start seeing him giving them instructions, right? Various instructions. So the last part is instructions to the church, or to believers, to the brethren, whichever one, because he uses those words a lot. But he's instructing specifically the Thessalonians, but he's giving these instructions. And then that's the segment division. But in this particular chapter 4, is Paul instructs the Thessalonians and the focus on the coming of Christ is he's dealing with something that's going to be very interesting when we get there and start studying it. But he's saying that some are alive and some are asleep, or I should go with the opposite. Some are asleep and some are alive at his coming. And all will be with him when he comes. So you've got some asleep and some alive. I did it right there. Some asleep and some alive at his coming. And all will be with him when he comes. I mean, these are kind of long chapter themes, but we're
Yeah, I just want to ask one question. I know I'm
Okay.
getting off track, but this falling asleep or whatever, some
Yeah.
people actually they believe that's soul sleep, and they really believe that once you don't
We'll
sleep.
study it. We'll study it further. So I just say put a
Oh,
bookmark
okay,
there.
because I don't believe it. There's
Right.
it. 'Cause they look at asleep, and I
Right.
don't want to bring it.
If you
Okay.
take there, that is probably the basis for the idea of soul sleep. So I agree
Yeah.
with that, but we will look at it further, but simply you can go to what Paul says in Philippians, where he says,
Yeah.
uh, uh, sorry, absent from the body, present with the
Yeah,
Lord.
I said that to somebody, and they go back, and I just
Okay,
Didn't
well,
want to get it.
we'll look at what it
Yeah, I
means.
didn't want to get in that conflict because it's, I said, okay, anyway, I'll leave it
So
alone.
there's other places that Paul uses this phrase, asleep, and we
Okay.
will look at it. And that's the beauty of, I know this is not going to answer all your questions, but it raises those questions. Write them down. It's always a good
Mhm.
idea whenever you're doing a study, just start writing down questions and then throughout the study, see if your questions are answered. And if not, you might need to do further study on that one. But that's a good question. But we're going to put a bookmark in it and we're going to look at that when we get to chapter 4.
Oh,
So
okay.
when we get to chapter 5, we're still in the section on instructions. Paul is giving them more instructions, and this is where you didn't write these down necessarily in your recipient list because it's just things he's telling them to do. But he's specifically teaching about what things, especially in the beginning.
The coming of the Lord.
Yeah. He's also teaching about times and epochs and the day of the Lord. And times and day of the Lord and of the Lord's and commands. He also gives them commands. That's the other. In regards to the coming of the Lord, he is praying for them that God would sanctify believers, preserve them complete, blameless at Christ's coming. So that's the second time we've seen this blameless at his coming. So God sanctifies believers, preserves complete, blameless at his coming. I don't even know if you can see all that, but so many times when we do chapter themes, we want them to be really short. But when you've got something like this where he is teaching dual all throughout, now there's a lot extra that he's teaching, not just these two things, but you see it in every chapter. You see this what are they dealing with and what's coming to the surface about the afflictions, about his need to instruct is what's going on down here. What is he instructing about? And then just there's always this focus on when Christ comes and what are like they're waiting for it. That's what it says in chapter 1. At his coming, they are going to be Paul's joy and crown of exaltation. I think there's one other word in there, but and then we hope to let the Lord establish our hearts blameless at his coming. And then some are asleep and some are alive at his coming, but all will be with him when he comes. And then you've got that the God sanctifies believers, preserves them complete, that we are blameless at his coming. So important. Blameless at his coming. I tell you, I could just camp out on that for a while. But as you look through, this is a quick overview of the book. We also have as a chapter theme, when you remember whenever you're doing a chapter theme, a book theme, whenever you're doing a book theme, your chapter themes should support it. And sometimes if you get a book theme, you might go back and go, I need to tweak some of my chapter themes. Like maybe I got a little too focused in on something rather than a little bit broader. But again, none of this is the gospel itself. So we got to know these are just tools for us to be able to explore this book and then to glance. That's the whole idea of an at a glance chart is you glance at it and you go, I remember now what that book was about. It just brings to your remembrance those things. So a book theme could possibly be the gospel received, they are to excel still more. There's your theme there. And they would be without blame at his coming. So the Excel still more does show up, Becky. I mean, at least in my themes. So if we were to decide what the purpose of Paul's writing is, we've talked about their circumstances that as we can figure them out on this brief overview. We've talked about the focus on the coming of Christ. I mean, just think about, for one thing, why are they so focused on the coming of Christ? And should we be? What does that cause in us? Or what causes are in our lives that cause us to focus on that? So some of those things will help you understand this book that much better. But what would you say Paul's goal is here? What's his purpose?
I don't know.
Living in light.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Jen, she's saying go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, Janice, go ahead.
Living in light of the day of the Lord.
Okay. So you think Paul's trying to convey that, like that it's the purpose is to say, here's how to live in light and
No,
with
live with the knowledge that the Lord is coming.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. That's good because what is going on that would cause them to need that?
Well, Paul is writing because he wanted to make sure the tempter hasn't tempted them away.
Right.
And they have all the idol worshipers around them. They're being afflicted.
Yes,
It would be easy to turn away.
it would be. And whatever circumstance you've ever been in, I think as a woman, I think about going through labor. The first time I had no clue, right? But the second, third, and fourth time I did have a clue. And I remember going into the labor and the second one going, dang, I've done this before. Why did I sign up for this? Right? But the hope I had was it was going to end.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The thing that made me able to get through it more in the second, third, and fourth one than the first one, because in the first one you have no clue. Like you have no idea I mean, yeah, technically you'd know it's going to end, but you hear those horror stories of people going 3 and 4 days, or 2 or 3 days, whatever. My longest labor was 5 hours from, really, it was intense, 5 hours or 4 hours. But the hope of it ending and the precious blessing of the child and all of that, but God even gives us that picture of the hope
Well,
that we have.
yeah, as a guy, I had a near death with COVID and,
Yeah.
intensive care twice. I was in there for 2 months. I mean, they didn't think I was going to make it. But I kept focusing on Christ and I said, I'm ready. And I made a loss like 40 pounds and
Yeah.
went through all yeah, it was, but
it's the hope that you end up
yeah, I
having.
had the hope. I really
Yeah.
did. So he brought you through that, like you guys going. I know my mom. She used to tell her about when she had 5 kids, and boy, never.
It's not easy.
No, I know.
And
So
whether or not, let's say it's I've heard stories about people recovering from like knee replacement or hip
yeah,
replacement or whatever. And it's tough. And you have to be pushed. And if you don't correctly push, like the PT giving you the parameters, taking you through it, if they don't push you, you're not going to regain your mobility. And Johnny just went through 3 surgeries on his left arm within 2 years for different things. And each time his hope and goal was that he would regain full use. And actually, a lot of times the surgeries were because if they didn't do the surgery, he would lose the use of his arm, and he didn't want that. He's only 65. So the point being, whatever we're going through, and in this case, they're going through opposition, tribulation, their own countrymen coming against them. The circumstances are dire. We'll just put it that way. They have to have hope. And that hope is in the coming of the Lord. And as you put it, uh, Janice put it, to live with the knowledge of that. That's important. So I will say, I wrote that they would that he was encouraging believers during suffering and they're suffering for God's word. But so it's to encourage or strengthen them in suffering. And really, however you put it, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the circumstances that they're in, and we need to look at our circumstances. And a lot of times I look at these circumstances and think, I'm so glad I don't live not only in those times, but in that culture. But we have our own struggles. We have our own problems. And not to conflate something into a problem that really is just a minor bump in the road, but we can have major issues in our lives. We can have physical problems. We can have spouse could have those problems, and we're concerned. Our children go through things. I was telling somebody the other day that, a lot of times I just mentioned going through labor, but you do get the blessing at the end. You get the baby. And then that baby grows up, and there's just nothing that you can experience that prepares you for the overwhelming and intense love that comes over you for that child. I mean, I joke, but it's like you just want to crush them to you because they're so precious, right? Like you just want to squeeze them to death. But there's also nothing like how much they can hurt you. But the worst part for me, well, there's been worse parts since, but while the kids were growing up, the things they would have to go through, the things they faced at school or whatever else, it was so much harder on me than it was whatever I went through when I was in high school. And yet, would you do it over? Yes, I would have them again. I would go through it again. It's worth it. And yet there is suffering. And some of you know, most of you might know, I have a child that has completely rejected us. And that there's no getting over that. There's no getting beyond it. There's no day that goes by that I don't think about it. And I've heard people say that about some of their losses. And I really thought, surely there's a day that you don't think about it, right? You can get involved in something, but honestly, there's not a day. There's not a day. And now my daughter's going through the rejection of the girl that she adopted, and we're secondarily rejected in that. And it's triggering a lot of that rejection feeling. And there's other relationships, but is that the same thing as what the Thessalonians went through? No, but Paul is not asking us, God is not asking us to move ourselves into this situation so that we experience it. He's saying, whatever suffering you're going through, how can you apply this? Can you know from Paul's experiences that Paul was destined for that affliction? Are we destined for the same affliction as Paul? No, I don't see that happening. But am I destined for affliction? Yes. If you don't know that, hear it from me. As a Christian, you're destined for affliction. How
Yeah,
can you strengthen
I
that?
mean, interrupt again, but Peggy, and it says there that the trials are there for a purpose because in James it talks about endurance,
Yes.
perseverance. So I mean, now
Yep.
my faith is like, whoa, it's
Well,
there
and Kay
for
has
growth.
a
I mean,
phrase.
it's there for growth. I would a
It
lot
is.
most like
Well, and
there
we
for
think
growth.
about however, whatever analogy you want to give to that, where the Olympics are going on right now. None of
Hmm.
those athletes got there easily.
Hmm.
They didn't just go to Milan and ski down the ski slope. No, it's from childhood through to that age, hours and hours and hours, pain, probably injury, but even just painful, muscles or whatever, and giving up things. There's a dedication and all to it. There's a picture there for us as Christians. If the caution is that we don't go into Christianity and think that that solves all of our earthly problems. If anything, it's going to cause more.
And a lot of people come to church thinking that.
Yes.
They really do. I mean, I've seen so many, and a lot of things I think I did too. You just think, okay, if it come to God, everything's going to go smooth,
Yeah.
So.
And that's the caution of that type of gospel, this easy believism, because it doesn't hold you. It doesn't last. It's probably not even true Christianity, but it certainly isn't going to encourage you in your suffering. And it's not,
Yeah.
we have to give people, and we have to live with the knowledge of his coming, because I had a pastor friend once say, and I'll close with this, but he was talking, I think I've mentioned this recently actually, but he was talking about how he was basically putting down such deep roots where they were living that he realized that wasn't the purpose God had for him. So they sold their house that they had built themselves and everything, and literally started traveling across the United States to find the place God wanted them. Well, they landed where we were. That lasted a little while, and then they've gone to several other places. They established a ministry that they still do to pastors. Actually, they have a retreat for pastors to regroup and refresh, because a lot of pastors burn out. And because of his experiences, which not all of which were great, he knows how to meet their needs, and he knows how to refresh and encourage them. But anyway, just the idea of, as we grow older, I think it's more and more true. More experiences you have, maybe life is not, easy. Life is not, how many times I've said to myself lately or out loud, my life right now is not what I expected it to be. And I've got a lot of good in my life. I've got a lot of amazing in my life. Um, but I've also got these hurts, and I've got these broken relationships, and it never feels right. I've had some bad church experiences, and I didn't turn away from God. I just recognized those as not healthy places. But, anyway, I could go on and on. But as these things accumulate more and more and more, when we were going through the deepest, hardest part with our son walking away from us, there were days I never wanted to commit suicide, don't get me wrong, but there were days I would have welcomed death. I would have welcomed getting out of this pain. And I just remember being at an intersection, and the light turned green, and I was about to go. And then this truck just comes barreling through the intersection. Had I, rushed to go on that light, I would have been broadsided. And I literally sat there, thanked God I didn't, thanked God, or asked God, if that were to ever happen, make it ultimate. Just let me die. I don't want to live, racked up in pain, and I'm done. The pain can be so bad sometimes that being with Jesus is a whole lot more better idea than dealing with what we're dealing with right now. But as Paul said, if I live, I live for Christ. If I die, it's my gain. And when I leave this body, I will be in the presence of Jesus. I would really like to be here when he comes, because I think that's going to be cool. But if I'm behind him, or if he's bringing me up, whichever, God will decide. I don't have to decide that. But let's close for now. We will come back next week with, hopefully, Lord willing, we'll discuss lesson 2, sorry, this was lesson 1. And we'll probably be, in chapter 1. So we'll do a chapter study this week. Again, our inductive study method is going to hold us true. I'm looking forward to this study already. It's been great. But be encouraged. The Lord is coming, and we have the strength and we have the examples of Paul. We have the examples of the Thessalonians. we have examples in our own life, and we can endure the suffering. And it does produce patience, and it produces endurance, and it produces, it proves out our faith. That's another thing that pain does. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I just thank you for this lesson. I thank you for all that we have already gleaned from this book. Many would just be completely satisfied and walked away, but we know we're going to go deep. We're going to stop and look at these individual chapters. We're going to figure out more and more and more. And we just ask you to guide that in us, that we would come to the understanding of things that you would have us, that we would be strengthened and we would be encouraged, and we would have our eyes on your ultimate return, that is the hope that we have before us, and the hope that gets us through the harder things, the focal point that we can look at. We thank you for that understanding, but we also thank you that we're going to be studying it, and it's going to be really, really, really solid. So we ask that you be with us as we study on our own, and when we come back together, and as we listen to the video from Kay in just a minute. We ask for it all in Jesus' name. Amen.